Let's start with the less painful punishments and work ourselves to the top to see if you can resist. Number 1. Keelhauling. Keelhauling was first introduced as a form of maritime punishment by Dutch sailors in the late 16th century, though its roots likely stretch back even further. This delightful little practice quickly became a favorite among sailors and pirates alike, because what better way to discipline a crew member than to drag them under the keel of a ship? If you were being keel-hauled, here's what you could expect. First, you'd be tied securely to a rope attached to the ship. Then, with the precision of a particularly sadistic orchestra conductor, the crew would toss you overboard and start pulling the rope, dragging your body along the barnacle-encrusted hull of the ship. These barnacles aren't just some slimy sea creatures. They're razor sharp, capable of slicing through skin like it's paper. As your body scrapes against the ship's bottom, you'd be torn apart, layer by layer. And that's not even the worst part. With every pull, you're submerged in water, fighting for breath with the constant fear of drowning lurking in your mind. Imagine you're on a modern-day cruise enjoying snacks and the view, when suddenly you trip and fall overboard. Now, instead of just splashing into the water, you find yourself being dragged under the massive hull of the ship while the cruise director's voice blares over the speakers announcing the next activity on board. A true nightmare. On the pain scale, it ranks a solid 6.5 because while it's terrifying and torturous, it's still just the beginning. The physical agony and psychological terror of keel hauling are horrific, but believe it or not, it's nothing compared to the unspeakable horrors of what's coming next. Number 2. Scaphism. Scaphism, also known as the boats, is an ancient Persian torture method reserved for the worst of criminals, and it's safe to say that death is a relief in this situation. Here's how it worked. The victim would be placed inside 2 wooden boats, or sometimes hollowed out tree trunks, with only their head, hands, and feet sticking out. Sounds uncomfortable already, right? But that was just the start. The victim was then force-fed a mixture of milk and honey, a seemingly kind gesture, but with the most sinister of intentions. This concoction would be smeared all over their exposed body parts as well, creating the ultimate bait for insects. What happened next was a slow-motion horror film. The milk and honey diet wasn't just for sustenance, it was to ensure the victim developed severe diarrhea, which would fester inside the boat, attracting even more insects. Flies, ants, and all manner of creepy crawlies would feast on the victim's flesh, laying eggs in the open wounds and orifices. Over days, sometimes weeks, the victim would be slowly devoured alive by the insects, all while trapped in a wooden coffin. The process was as slow as it was excruciating, with the victim rotting away inch by agonizing inch. On the pain scale, Scaphism easily ranks a 7 out of 10. But honestly, it's hard to quantify something so uniquely horrific. The sheer cruelty of being eaten alive over days, perhaps weeks, is a level of suffering that's almost unimaginable. And yet, as ghastly as this punishment is, there are even worse fates on this list. The next punishment turns up the heat, literally, and takes the suffering to a whole new level. Number 3. Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull, a true masterpiece of ancient Greek cruelty, was the brainchild of Phalaris, a tyrant of Sicily who decided that simply executing people wasn't enough. No, he needed to make a spectacle out of it. Enter the Brazen Bull, designed by an inventive, if not utterly sadistic, sculptor named Perilaus. This wasn't just any execution method, it was an elaborate theater of pain. Here's how it worked. The victim was placed inside a hollow, life-size bronze bull, which was then sealed shut. A fire was lit beneath the bull, turning it into a giant oven. As the flames heated the metal, the victim inside was roasted alive. But in a grim twist of innovation, the bull was designed with a series of tubes that converted the victim's screams into the sound of a bull bellowing. Yes, you were not only cooked alive, but your agony was transformed into a grotesque symphony for the audience's entertainment. Now imagine the Brazen Bull set in modern times. A bronze bull with a high-tech sound system that plays exaggerated mooing sounds, coupled with comically inappropriate music tracks like Disco Inferno. As the victim's cries echo inside, the crowd outside is treated to a bizarre, twisted soundtrack. Its execution as a macabre musical performance, complete with all the wrong tunes. On the pain scale, the Brazen Bull is a searing 7.5 out of 10. The slow, agonizing heat combined with the psychological torment of knowing your final cries are being converted into a morbid, mocking soundtrack makes this one of history's cruelest punishments. And yet, as horrific as being roasted alive in a metal bull sounds, the worst is still to come. Brace yourself, because the next punishment on our list turns the dial of cruelty up even further. Number 4, rat torture. Rat torture is a method so horrifying that it makes even the bravest among us cringe. This gruesome form of punishment, employed in various cultures throughout history, was designed to exploit one of humanity's most primal fears: rats. These creatures, already feared for their association with filth and disease, were turned into instruments of sheer terror. Here's how the process unfolded. The victim was restrained, usually lying flat on their back, completely unable to move. A large rat was then placed on their exposed abdomen, and a metal container, like a bucket or a pot, was placed over the rat, trapping it against the person's skin. The true horror began when the torturer started heating the metal container. Rats, being creatures of survival, are incredibly resourceful when trying to escape danger. As the temperature inside the container began to rise, the rat, driven by panic and desperation, would seek the only possible escape route, downward through the victim's flesh. The rat would begin clawing, scratching, and gnawing through the skin and muscle, attempting to burrow its way to freedom. The victim would experience unimaginable pain as the rat tunneled deeper into their body, causing severe internal injuries. The agony wasn't just physical. The psychological torment of knowing what was happening to your body inch by inch added another layer of terror to this nightmarish ordeal. On the pain scale, rat torture easily ranks a 9.5 out of 10. The combination of physical pain, psychological terror, and the prolonged suffering made this one of the most brutal and feared punishments in human history. And yet, as horrifying as this is, there are hundreds of punishments that are a 10 out of 10. And now I will tell you my worst one. Number 5, flaying. Flaying, one of the most excruciating punishments ever imagined, is where the line between pain and sheer agony becomes almost indistinguishable. This gruesome method was practiced in various cultures throughout history, including the Assyrians, Aztecs, and medieval Europeans. It involved the removal of a victim's skin, often while they were still alive, leading to unimaginable suffering and inevitably death. Here's how it went down. The victim, usually condemned for some serious crime or as an act of war, would be stripped of their clothing and tied down. The executioner, with a precision that can only be described as chilling, would begin slicing through the skin, often starting at the face or feet. The skin would be carefully peeled away from the body in large sheets, all while the victim remained conscious, feeling every agonizing cut. The pain was beyond comprehension, as the skin is filled with nerve endings that transmit the sensation of being cut, torn, and peeled. Death would eventually come, but only after hours or even days of excruciating torment, either from shock, blood loss, or infection. Flaying wasn't just a punishment, it was a statement. The skin was sometimes displayed as a macabre trophy, a warning to others about the consequences of defying authority. The victim's suffering was intended to be as public and humiliating as possible, turning the act of execution into a horrifying spectacle. Here's a funny twist. Instead of skin, picture your most embarrassing old internet search history being flayed and displayed for all to see. Every awkward search, every questionable late-night inquiry exposed to the world. Each secret laid bare for public humiliation. The psychological torment of having your deepest, darkest digital secrets revealed would add a whole new layer of suffering, one that in today's world might feel just as unbearable as the physical pain. On the pain scale, flaying is a solid 10 out of 10. The sheer physical agony combined with the psychological torment of such an intense and prolonged death makes this one of the most feared punishments in human history. And with that, we've reached the peak of human cruelty, and a reminder of just how not to try this at home. Hope your stomach was empty.